Hey folks, and welcome back. Today we're going to jump right in with another Dungeon Basics video. Now, if you followed the previous three, then you already have dungeon tiles, pillars, and doorways available to you. Now these are the basic building blocks for a lot of different types of dungeons. I mean, a dungeon can be anything, but just those three alone will get you pretty far. So, video series over. I'll see you on the next one. If you could like and subscribe, then... Okay, not so much. Really though, from here we can move on to doing more advanced things or to filling up these dungeons. Now what you need in specific for your campaign is probably going to be different from anybody else or from me. But we can start with some items that have proven useful for me over and over and over. Things that always manage to find their way to the table. The kinds of scatter and objects that no matter what type of campaign you're running, these end up being involved. We're doing that today. We're going to start by building some rubble. You can find this in dwarven ruins, at the base of a jungle temple, or, I don't know, in a maze of coral canyons under the sea. It fits in just about anywhere, and it's always a useful piece of scatter or cover to be able to put on your table. As usual, we're going to be looking at 3 different methods for this craft. The first one is 3D printing. The second one is going to be using foam and tools that we already have in the craft room. And the third one is an absolute no-budget scheme for building us some rubble that we can use in our games. Us. As usual, we're going to be looking at 3 different methods for crafting this. The first one is going to be 3D printing. The second is going to use foam and tools that we already have in the crafting room. And for the third one, it's an absolute no-budget crafting method that can get some rubble onto your table immediately. Let's get started. I'm starting today with foam craft rubble. I need some suitable bases to start with, and the easiest way to get them is to start with the hot wire tool and just kind of hack away at them, really, until you get a shape you like. Something you want to work with. It's more art than science, so just have a play with it, cut some odd angles and mess about. And if you don't have a hot wire tool, then of course this is super easy to do with a knife as well. Just be careful, yeah? Don't cut yourself. I mean, you're probably going to cut yourself eventually if you do this long enough, but no reason it has to be today. Still, I keep band-aids in the craft area, and so should you if you're playing with knives. Some people will say, don't ever cut towards yourself. That isn't true. You should always cut carefully, but you should cut in the direction that gives you the most control over where the knife is going. It's really an uncontrolled knife that is a dangerous knife. Once I'm satisfied with the state of the bases, I just take an old foam offcut. You never throw away your offcuts, by the way. They're almost always useful at some point, even if it's just for turning into bricks. But yeah, I take an old offcut and just start randomly carving away at it until it looks like rocks. And again, there's really no wrong way. Just give it some angles and some odd planes, and you're pretty much good. Once you've got some rock shapes, you're going to need some rock textures. And for that, we're going to use the classic tinfoil ball trick. It's a little trickier with these odd shapes, but just apply some pressure and get some texture onto it. It doesn't have to be perfect. I also had a bit of a wood textured log sort of thing from a previous video, so I threw that in my parts pile as well. The next step is texturing the bases. I just sort of get out things that I think might be fun to use. I have aquarium gravel and some sort of chunky texture bits from Green Stuff World, as well as the sack of dirt I always use. I use Mod Podge to glue the texture bits down, because I find that Mod Podge is unlikely to warp your project. If you're using PVA glue instead, you're going to have to be careful, because if you use too much, it will definitely warp. And then you're really just having a bit of playtime with it again. Put things down, rearrange them, and fuss with it until you're happy. Or tired of fussing with it, at least. And then to finish it off, I sprinkle sand over top to make sure there aren't really any spots that are missing texture completely. Once the Mod Podge is dry, I start arranging all the pieces.
I have some basic idea of what I might like to do with them, but if you don't, you can really just start gluing things down until it looks good, or until you build the base. Next, I take some foam bricks I already had made. I did this in a previous video, and this is for sure one of the reasons you want to keep your offcuts. I just glue them in a random pattern, like maybe a wall partially collapsed or was smashed in by a previous adventurer or a monster. They're rubble in a dungeon, after all, so if it looks rough, then that's perfectly appropriate. I decided to take some butcher's twine too and make a sort of a rope around one end of the log. I don't know to what purpose exactly, but I think it looks neat, and it adds to the old, abandoned sort of look I'm going for. And while I was doing that, though, I noticed that I didn't really like the way that the log beam was sitting on the stones. It's sort of an awkward joint. So I tore up some old paper towel and used watered down glue and an old brush to just push the towel over it and into all the cracks and sort of cover up the awkward bit. It adds another layer of detail as well. Like maybe this is an old torn up tent or a sleeping roll or maybe even a tapestry or something from whatever purpose your dungeon originally served. That's why you don't have to be afraid to make mistakes doing this sort of thing. They're usually really easy to cover up. While I was doing all of that, I had my 3D printer and curing station hard at work printing up these free files from my mini factory. They took about an hour and change to print completely.
Alright folks, so with our foam rubble completely constructed and our resin rubble printed, it's almost time to move on to painting. But you know how we do it here at Dungeon Basics, we have to at least try to do a version of this completely for free. So, I went outside and I got this. Now along with this, I'm going to be using the same dirt and sand that I always use. Now this is something that I got outside myself, but right now it's winter in Canada, so if I wanted to go out and actually gather dirt specifically for this, I'd need a snow shovel, a regular shovel, maybe a flamethrower, but at the end of the day, it's all the same. You want to take anything that you gather from outside for crafting though and bake it in the oven. Just put it at 375 and cook it for an hour. It's going to make your house smell a little funny, but it's also going to make sure that there's nothing living in or on your crafting materials that might cause it to mold or rot later on.
As bases for our no-budget rubble, I picked out two different things. I've got a bit of thick cardstock and an old plastic card. This was actually from a previous job, like an ID card sort of thing, but used gift cards or any of those fake sort of crap cards they send you in the mail as advertisements. They're perfect for this. And then I just follow the same steps as before. It's Mod Podge, sand and rubble, and then having a play with the sticks and stones and any other interesting bits you are able to find around where you live. It's really not difficult at all, and it's definitely something that even beginning crafters can handle without issue. I like this next step. It's time for a coat of black paint and Mod Podge. You can use PVA if you want here, but again, there are just bigger worries about warping them. And this goes on everything, except for the 3D prints. They just get a good old rattle can spray of dark grey. But the foam and no budget rubble get a generous coat. In addition to giving us a base coat, this helps really lock everything down and glue it in place.
Okay, so with that done and the Mod Podge dry, it's time to paint. I did take the liberty of doing a basic black base coat over all of the pieces because there simply wasn't enough black paint in the Mod Podge. If you need to do the same thing, I just use flat black craft paint. Whatever you have on hand is fine. For the painting, aside from the 3D printed pieces, I'm largely going to be using the same method that we've been using on all the other dungeon basic stuff so far. That's both to keep it consistent, after all this is fallen rubble from the same dungeon, so it should look roughly the same, but it's also so that these are generic enough so that when you grow your collection, you can use these in other places. Like I said, it could be outside of a burned down building, it could be in an underground cave, it could be in a bandit hideout, or, in the ruins in a fallen jungle. Any of that's fine as long as you make these generic enough. It's kind of important with modular terrain. So I'm going to start in on that now.
I use burnt umber as the base coat for all the dirt and the low rubble around the bases. You can use a lighter brown if you want, but I like this and it helps make the lighter stones and things pop more because of the dark background. I take 2 different grey craft paints, a sort of light medium grey and a darker one, and just start base coating in the rocks and bricks. For any wood pieces, I start with burnt sienna craft paint, but again, it's really down to just how you want your wood to look. If you want something older, then incorporating some greys might be fine, or some people prefer a brown that leans less yellow than this one. I picked burnt sienna because it was the first brown that I found in my bin of craft paints. Yeah.
Okay, so our base coats are done on the handcrafted pieces, but we're going to do the 3D printed ones a little bit differently. The 3D printed pieces have a much higher level of detail than the handcrafted ones, and I want to still use a very basic paint job and method to bring out those details as easily as we can without putting in too much effort. So I've picked out a few bricks in different colors, and now I'm going to do a dry brush of an off-white over the entire piece. After that, I'm going to be using contrast paints and washes in basically a modified slap chop or underpainting technique to bring out the colors and details on the pieces. The same washes will be going on the handcrafted pieces after, so we just have to mix it up a little bit and kind of stagger how we're painting them to get the easiest results.
For the dry brush on the 3D prints, I used Drake Tooth, but really any light color is going to be great here. And since I had it out, I also dry brushed over everything else. Staggering your paint jobs like this is a great way to save time so that you don't end up doing multiple dry brushing sessions when you really only need one. Make sure you dry brush the ground texture as well while you're at it. I don't want to go into a crazy amount of detail painting the 3D prints, but I do want to give them a bit of pop at least, so I picked out a few parts of each to do in brighter colors. The rest will get generic browns and greys. It's not the highest detail paint job in the world, but it does read really well when it's on the table, and that's what's important. Really, you can pick out as many or as few details as you're comfortable with here. Personally, I have more crafting projects than I have time, so I just pick out the things I think will be most interesting. Then it's time for a couple of homemade brown washes, one light and one dark. This part is nice and simple, and sloppy and fun, but you're going to want to make sure you put a piece of paper down or newspaper or something, at least if you use the painting style I do, which is to kind of just liberally splash these everywhere indiscriminately. Again, if you didn't catch it in a previous video, these washes are just water, dish soap, and acrylic paint. All stuff you already have, I hope. I mean, if you don't have water, then you've got bigger fish to... Well, not fish. I guess if you don't have water, you don't have fish, but bigger problems. I really need a better editor, better scriptwriter.
So while we wait for that to dry, there is something that I want to talk about. I'm sure some of you that are new to crafting are probably thinking, did this guy just take a bunch of rocks and wood and repaint them to look like rocks and wood? Yeah, I did. And there are 2 reasons for that. One of those is uniformity, which is to say I don't put anything on my table that I didn't paint. And that's because if you take a real rock and put it on the table without modification, it's going to make everything else on your table look fake. You're going to destroy the illusion that you're working so hard to create with the rest of your terrain. The other reason is scale. That is to say that big rocks, which is what we're pretending these are, don't actually look the same as little rocks, which is what they really are. Same with pieces of wood. A big piece of wood and a little piece of wood don't actually have the same texture. Light doesn't reflect off of them in quite the same way because of scale, and in reality, they don't look right. But if you repaint them, they take on a uniform look with the rest of your creations, the rest of your terrain, and they look perfect in your setting. Alright, so with that covered, those might be dry by now, maybe. Let's take a look at the finished product. Let's start with the handcrafted terrain. The pros list, they look pretty good. They're fun to make. You can get creative, try out different techniques because it's pretty harmless if something goes wrong on one of these. But you can mess with twine and paper towel and whatever you've got, throw it on there and see what you can make. It's actually kind of a good time if you're into that. These are also going to really closely match your dungeon tiles if you've also made those yourself. You're going to be using the same techniques and the same paint scheme, so there's no reason they shouldn't look right at home in your dungeon. On top of that, if you already own the materials, they're pretty cheap and easy to make. The downside, of course, is that they also take the most time out of all of these. Having to hand carve bricks and hand texture wood, it takes longer. And if you need them in a rush or you're just not into that project, that's not a great thing. That brings us to the 3D printed terrain. I like these ones, but if you don't have a 3D printer, that's obviously a big problem. They're certainly the most detailed of the group, and after costs for resin, these were free files by the way, they come out to about $1 a piece, and that's pretty hard to beat. There's also a benefit in time spent, because I just press print on the printer and then I go into the other room and do something else, or continue on a different project. Either way, they don't take up much of my actual time. And the downside is, as always, the initial output for the 3D printer. As far as initial cost goes, it's the most expensive method. Alright, now let's talk about the zero cost, no budget solution for this, where literally everything I used was free except for the paint and glue. The pros. Obviously no money was spent. That's a pretty big pro. I mean, if you're doing sort of a budget conscious game, which these days there's no reason not to be, then that's a great pro. They also look pretty good. If you're careful to select pieces of wood and stones that have a good texture baked into them, then that texture comes out when you dry brush them and when you wash them, and they're going to be, pretty crisp, pretty high detail pieces. As far as cons go, well, they do look a little different than handcrafted terrain. If everything else you have is handcrafted, these aren't going to quite look exactly the same if that matters to you. They're also just, a little trickier to get. It really depends on where you live. If you're in the middle of a city, it might not be so easy to go outside and just get some bark and some rocks and dirt and make some terrain out of it. I happen to live out in the middle of nowhere. The only thing preventing me from doing an even more detailed job on this is that it's the middle of winter. But not everyone has access to the same kinds of materials, so it's going to be really dependent on what kind of environment you're living in, but that's the creative process for it, right? Get out there, have a look around, think in miniature, and see what you can find around you that might be useful. Now, personally, I kind of like all of them. They all have their place, they all look a little bit different, have different functions. I'm going to keep all of these, and they're probably all going to get used on my table at some point. So there's really no loser here. They're all good projects, and they're all going to look great at the end of the day. Alright folks, that about wraps it up. If you have any requests for things that you would like to see covered in Dungeon Basics, things that you're not sure how to craft or you want to see someone else's take on it, or what a low or no budget version might look like, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to take a crack at it. Otherwise, we're going to be moving on to more scattered terrain, more scenery, and more reusable items that will find a lot of places in whatever kind of dungeon you're running. Thank you for watching. Please hit like and subscribe. It really does help, and I appreciate it, everyone who already is subscribed. I'll see you on the next one.